So here we are. Thank you everybody for joining us today for our inaugural Meet the Media webinar. Super excited to do this one because obviously as PR Director for Growth Studio, it's really personal and interesting to me, but also hoping that the fantastic journalists and co-presenters we have today have some very valuable and insightful information to share that everyone will benefit from today. So I'm just going to kick off with saying welcome and also just sharing a couple of housekeeping tips for how we're going to run the webinar today. First thing is that the session is going to be recorded, so hopefully everyone is okay with that. We will have a link that we can reshare as well after the webinar, so that's available. And then also we're going to run the conversation for about 30-35 minutes, and then the remaining half of this webinar is going to be open to Q&As. So if you can, please share your questions till then. We're expecting a fair few of them, especially from our cohort that always have tons of brilliant questions that they ask. So yeah, if you can manage to share that, use your hands up signal in the platform, and we will get to you, and we'll try and get to all of you if we can within this session. So that's housekeeping done. For anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Gaby, PR Director at Growth Studio, about 25 years in PR, and working with the team at Growth Studio currently on the Accelerator program. I'm going to introduce you to Paul Finch first, who's on the call here. Paul is co-founder of Growth Studio and co-designer of Breathable Cities. Paul, why don't you share with everyone who we are and what we do?
I forgot to pack my shirt this morning, and I'm sitting in a cupboard in Soho, but I am a professional most of the time. So I'm one of the founders of Growth Studio. Thanks, Gaby. We are a global startup accelerator, and we specialize in early stage technologies whose solutions protect and preserve the planet. So we've been going about 8 years. We've worked with over 700 startups around the world, particularly in the UK, in the Middle East, in the Baltics, and America. And our current cohort is the Breathable Cities program, which is one of the only and the biggest accelerators that's dedicated to reducing and preventing air pollution in cities. We're about halfway through the program, so many of the people here are on that program. We're always really keen to learn more about technologies in the space, so please feel free to reach out to me, to Gaby, to Growth Studio, if you'd like to hear more about the program, if you'd like to come to our demo day, or if you'd like to come to more events like these. Yeah, we're always keen to say hello and always keen to hear from you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. David, if you would like to introduce yourself next.
By all means. Hi, everyone. Okay, yeah, sure. My name's Dave Vetter. I've been a journalist around 16 years. I cover climate and sustainability. In particular for Forbes at the moment. I'm a media and sustainability consultant at Oxford's Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and for some private firms and founders. And I am completing an MSc in sustainability at Oxford right now with a focus on transition analytics and sustainable finance.
Wow, busy man. Thanks, David. Simon, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, it's quite a hard act to follow. I'm Simon Hancock. I had a long career at the BBC for over 20 years in the tech innovation space and science, sort of science touching science as well. The last 10 years, I was running kind of a lot of the BBC's tech and innovation coverage. Probably one of the biggest things was running the weekly tech show Click with a team of sort of 20 people in the UK, but also teams around the world. 18 months ago, myself and my deputy editor on Click left to set up our own company, Electric Eels Studios. We still do kind of broadcast work for the BBC and others, but we also kind of work with companies as well, kind of advising on kind of media strategy and developing content as well. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So I'm going to kick off with a bit of a foundation question, if that's okay, because I think and I sense that, you know, not everybody understands the weird alchemy of PR and media, and it can be a little bit hidden from view. And I think even to ourselves, there probably isn't exactly a rule book as to how this works. But just to head this up, David and Simon, how would you describe the process? So once a startup has presented a story to you, either face to face or through a press release or, you know, online outreach, what happens to that story, and how does it get to the point of either acceptance or rejection? So shall we start with David on that one?
Oh God. Well, I mean, so startups find it pretty hard to break through, of course, and that's kind of the point. And what I look for in a startup story is going to be very different to what, say, Forbes is looking for. And I think a key point to stress here is every outlet, and even, I mean, every journalist is looking for something very different, and they all have their own beat. So personally, what I look for in a story is a team that isn't simply interested in a big exit. I want to know their philosophy of change, how they plan to make life better for everyone, and how they fit in. And I'm interested in systems personally. But again, that's me. Another journalist might be very, very different. And also, of course, you've also got to take into account the kind of the Forbes business model, which is essentially clickbait. So how am I gonna sell this story? And I think if you're interested in getting this story out there, it is kind of vital you get your head around a little bit of how the media works, especially in the social media age, where there's been this kind of divergence between, not just between broadcast and online, but between online and print. And everyone, you know, some people have a paywall and some people don't. Some people are just completely ad-based. So yeah, I mean, the journalists you're likely to be reaching out to might be something more like me, where I'm essentially self-employed. You can pitch to different publications, but I mean, I can pitch ideas to wherever, and wherever I think might be most applicable to your offering. And I shoulder all the risk, because I essentially, a lot of us out here, we're getting paid by the click. So think about the platform you're using. Where can I go from there, Gabby? Shall I add anything?
Well, I think that's I think it's an honest appraisal of how things are in reality. Once you've looked at a story and you like the look of it, David, what happens then? Where do you have to take that? Who then makes the next decision?
Okay, that boils down to the outlet. So if I'm writing for Forbes, I have the luxury, according to their business model, I have the luxury of printing anything I want, essentially. I just have to make it work.
Right.
So it's all down to me. If I'm newsroom, which I have been, you know, it'll be down to the editor. Does the editor think this has got legs, and is it going to get the sort of readership they're looking for, or hit the right demographics? So in my case, I make my own deadlines. Yeah. And as a contributor, I can pitch to wherever I want. I could choose to publish on Forbes whenever I want, but at the same time, that's got to key in with kind of news cycles. You know, has it got a news hook? It's very, very fluid, and you know, I just have to adapt to whatever the situation might be. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. What makes clickable content in a couple of our next questions. Thanks, David. Simon, how's the process within broadcast? Is that different?
So if you take the BBC, for example, you mentioned the word alchemy there, and I think as a startup, there's always going to be a great degree of luck, really, in getting your kind of company sort of front and center, be it on the kind of website or, you know, radio, TV, whatever. At the BBC, each program or section has its own editor. Those editors have a huge amount of autonomy. So in a sense, they're the people ultimately you need to kind of get the get the green light from. But equally, the reporters themselves have a huge amount of freedom as well to go out, find those stories, and they will be trusted to pitch those into those individual editors. So broadly speaking, that's the kind of mechanism. But obviously, you know, in a startup, as in all ways, I suppose, is kind of scrapping around, really trying to kind of get in front of people and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose what I would say is that it's surprising, in my experience, just how many startups aren't great at, as you described it, Gaby, packaging up their story or having an awareness really of where their story sits in the wider world. By which I mean relative to news fashions or news trends of the day, things which will kind of potentially give you a bit of an edge in trying to kind of become more relevant in the eyes of those editors and reporters. So I think you do need to, there is a thing with startups, I think, where you're so kind of pitching kind of almost sort of inwardly into the world of investment and everything that sometimes people forget just to take a step back, or maybe they need some help to take a step back and just look at where their solution or whatever it might be, their product, fits in some of the kind of biggest stories and trends that are taking place in the world. And I think if you've got a bit more of a handle on that, you can at least give yourself more of a chance of, or give yourself a fighting chance, basically, of kind of gaining interest. But I mean, there's no, if only there were a kind of magic formula for these things. There isn't, is the truth. I think all you can really do is try and build those relationships where you can with those individuals, have an awareness of what they're looking for and understanding, or try and kind of increase your understanding of what the type of thing they're looking for, and look that, you know, if for example you're a kind of air quality startup, for example, you know, you're looking for moments in the news calendar where that is going to be being talked about a lot. And, you know, maybe, you know, in a month's time that Sadiq Khan or something is going to do a big moment to try and bring some awareness that, well, look, try and get ahead of that and try and use that as a way of, you know, people call it newsjacking, but basically plugging into the news calendar to give yourself a bit of a leg up. So that's the kind of ways of, I would suggest, you want to be thinking about things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to dwell on that topic a little bit, is, David, a question for you then, something that Simon picked up on there is, you know, often startups can't see yet how to package a great story. And that's perhaps where they fall down at the first hurdle. So to be really pragmatic about this, what last couple of stories have you written around a climate startup or a sustainable startup that did pique your interest and did achieve those clicks? Can you give us an example of what that sort of best practice story looks like?
Well, I don't know that. Okay, so I think there's a couple of separate things going on there. I think that, excuse me, there are dogs barking outside, so I'll close the window. So I think that people I think that startups have to follow a whole other set of, sorry. Okay, so essentially the things that are going to appeal to me, that's not necessarily the problem with the pitch. I think we need to deal separately with how startups are pitching to media and with the things that I've done. So I think that in some senses there are two separate things going on here. I like systems innovations and a bit of controversy. So if you can find a sort of a grit, a speck of grit in the story around which you form the sort of the pearl of your innovation, I think that can be quite appealing. So, for example, I've done some work around soil carbon, and soil carbon startups they're a great example of a story with a lot of uncertainties, and a lot of diverging opinions in the science and in the MRV. My favorite startup stories have been entrepreneurs in Africa, in fact, who create incredible things from almost nothing. And these grab my attention because they're innovating in conditions of extreme adversity. And in the West, we suffer from a misconception that people in Africa have no agency of their own, and so on and so forth. So that's fitting. That has the systems context that appeals to me a lot. But I think in terms of how do startups break through, I think we have to deal with that a little bit separately, because there's a difference between me picking a story and then those guys may not have come to me at all. I may have gone out and found them.
Sure.
And then there are people who come to me and they sell me on their thing, or they don't. And I'm like, okay, well, in that case, these guys deserve some time and they deserve some space. So yeah, so I think there's two separate things there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can dive into that a bit more. What about you though, Simon? I think in terms of understanding what was the last great story that really piqued your interest? And
yeah, I mean, I've picked two examples which I think kind of shed a little bit of light on what I think startups can do to sort of, again, give themselves the best chance. So that may not be directly to answer your question, but it kind of gets us into some of the meat, I think. So I noticed yesterday there was that story, I don't know if you saw it, about the cargo ship that was being fitted with these so-called kind of wind wings. I don't know if you saw this. It sort of piqued my it kind of rang a bell, because we'd covered this as a startup called Oceanbird, doing something similar in Sweden, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. And what was it that kind of drew me to that startup? And I think it's if you kind of, I don't know, unfortunately I should have brought the picture to show people, but if you see the picture of this boat with its wind wings, it's extremely intriguing. It's intriguing visually, which from a broadcast point of view, but actually, to be honest, be that broadcast or web, you know, that it's a great image, and you're drawn into that. So that is a really good starting point. But actually, the big
and share that. Look, Google it and share it in the chat.
Yeah, if someone could chuck it up there. So yeah, as I say, so this was something we kind of covered in Sweden a few years ago. This was a different company actually doing something similar, a UK company actually, which was nice to see. But obviously the big thing here is that it's trying to solve a problem. It's a really good way of, as someone who has the public interest at heart, it gives you a way into talking about some of the issues around cargo ships and their emissions and the problem that is, and this needs to be tackled, which can be, quite a dry subject, but suddenly you've got a way into that. Plus the fact you've got that kind of intellectual almost exercise of looking at this. Is this a real thing? Is this, what are the trade-offs here? Well, like if you've got these wing things, it's like, well, can you be lifting cars off and on the ship and all this? So it's just kind of quite intriguing, kind of intellectually. So obviously at the point at which they're doing this test now, that's 4 or 5 years after we first kind of covered that story, as very much as a startup embryonic thing, where probably all we had was a kind of, probably just a couple of CGI images and that kind of stuff. So those are the sort of things. That's one sort of example of something that kind of elevates something to be quite an interesting story. The other story I very quickly thought I'd share was it just popped into my head actually when I was thinking about this. I was at the GITEX tech show in Dubai a couple of years ago, and I was coming up to make a program about environmental startups in Japan. And while I was at this big mega show, they have a kind of country room where they have startups from each of these different countries, like so Japan, Indonesia, whatever. So I went to have a look at the Japanese startups, and I came across a really intriguing startup called ARC, which is a sustainable shrimp solution, which basically has a kind of end-to-end shrimp production facility placed in a kind of small shipping container. Nice enough story, and in the Japanese context, where they kind of they consume a lot of seafood and what have you. It's quite interesting to go and feature. But the thing that sold that to me was the founder. Absolutely incredible guy, really interesting, engaging. He was there. Who knew that someone like myself was going to walk into that hall and start talking to him? Well, no, he had no idea, because I'm very unlikely, but I did. And he was ready there with his stats about aquaculture. He really told me, really kind of explained in the right amount of detail, why this was a great solution and what the problem was that it was solving. But on top of that, he then went on to kind of help and advise me on a number of other interesting kind of startups in a different space in Japan. So he kind of almost became a bit of advisor for me. And I suppose the point is there, what he did there was he had this nugget of an opportunity there, and he absolutely seized it. And he made, he absolutely kind of gave himself the best possible chance that I was going to cover him. And sure enough, when I went to Japan to make this program, I made a beeline for him, and we did a really lovely four-minute piece about him, and this lovely solution that he put in a car park, and etc., which has led to huge amounts of investment, global investment into his startup. So again, it's like you've just got to give yourself every possible chance that when this moment comes, that you can seize it. Yeah. And that's the key message, I think, really.
Can I just pick up on something that, sorry to feel very rude. Can I pick up on something Simon mentioned around trade-offs? I think this is really key. Now, I think there's a tendency for some founders to steer clear of discussing the trade-offs. And this, to me, this is a very interesting part of the story. And I wanted to highlight this, that you need to highlight kind of the friction there, that where your solution is going to meet the real world. At some point, the rubber's going to hit the road. And I think I don't think you should shy away from that. And I think you should make it part of your story, that there's this adversity and you've got to overcome that. Don't be all like, oh, we're the best at this. No one, there are not going to be any problems bringing this to scale, because no one believes it anyway. So confront it head on. That's all I wanted to add.
I think I completely agree with you. There was when Google weren't the kind of megacorp they now are, I sort of would go and visit them in Silicon Valley once or twice a year. And what was great for many years was that they would do exactly as Dave is describing there. They would show you a new kind of experimental translation product or whatever, and then they'd almost laugh at you and say, well, obviously it doesn't really work properly, but the thing was, you kind of got the, and then they would explain why it was so difficult, and how, if you did it like this, you'd have to have, walk around with a massive filing cabinet on your back or whatever. And so it brings that, exactly that, it brings that kind of shades of grey to the story, which makes it so much more interesting. I think that's a really good point.
And it also makes you more human, and people want, in the media, and editors in particular, they want human interest. They want stories to be human. They don't want it to be box ticking.
I mean, on that point that you've just made, David, how important is the founder in the startup story?
I mean, they're crucial, and not to blow anyone's trumpet, but no, of course they're crucial. The philosophy of use, the philosophy of change, the vision of change it's all about that, right? And if they're not on board with it and don't want to go all the way with it, I'm going to sniff that out, and other people are going to sniff that out. It's just not going to come through. It's not going to chime. So yeah, you've got to believe your thing. Like I mentioned, that you're not just going for an exit. You just want to sell this thing off. You want to be part of it. You want to build it, and yeah. So it's that kind of sincerity, and I think that's what the founder brings, and yeah, essential.
So we're talking about some great tools that help startups package their story. I think you've talked about the honesty, the transparency, the adversity part of it. And I think also, Simon, you've touched on the importance of a visual asset, to be able, especially for broadcast, obviously, but to be able to see a product and appreciate it in either a filmic way or through powerful imagery. I mean, how important is that in the whole story package? How much time, money, investment should startups invest in creating great imagery and or film content, particularly if they're not, there might not be hardware, there might be hidden software. So how important is that to think about in terms of creatively presenting a story through visualization?
Do you want me to go, or Simon?
Yeah, David, why don't you?
Sure. I mean, it's fantastic when people bring us, brilliant imagery and video, and it really sets the story off. An image tells a gazillion words and all that stuff, and especially if your innovation is difficult to visualize. If you come up with a way of visualizing it, so much the better.
Yeah.
And if it's something generic, that's going to switch people right off. It's going to switch me right off, or any other journalist. And yeah, Simon mentioning the shipping using the wings, and I've seen other versions where they use a kind of spinnaker, and it is really engaging, visually engaging. In terms of how much resources, nowadays we have the luxury. The barrier to entry for doing this stuff is lower than ever, right? You can produce a little video, or get your mobile phone can do really press-worthy images. So there's not much of a barrier to entry, and doing it in such a way that looks professional is also easier than ever. So I genuinely think it's worth putting that in there. And let's say, okay, so I get what, 500, 600. Sometimes I get 500 or 600 PR emails a day, and most of them contain no images. Most of them, I would say 90%, maybe more. But if you've got something visual, we are visual animals. We're attracted by visuals, and put the time in. Don't you're not going to spend 50% of your time. Get a friend to help or whatever. But it's really, really, really valuable, and I think it's such amazing bang for your buck.
Brilliant. That's a good tip. Simon, anything to add to that at all?
Well, obviously you can be too early to need this stuff, obviously, and so it's having a bit of an awareness where you are on the journey. You don't want to throw money away, but as David says, it very much can be the difference between, if you've got the right imagery, be that video or stills. I can assure you from hundreds of experiences that it can very much be the difference between getting coverage or not. And if you think, it comes back to what I said before, it's like, what you don't want to do is, if that magical moment happens where you can get some coverage really without perhaps even been looking for it, really, to lose that opportunity because you haven't got that seems crazy, really. So yeah, it's as I say, it's like you can be too early for it for sure, but there certainly comes a moment where you really should be thinking about those assets, I would say.
Brilliant. So before we open for questions, just a couple more questions for you both. Obviously, we are representing here Breathable Cities. We are supporting clean air startups. Are there any specific tips you could give some of our clean air startups in terms of shaping and packaging their story? Is it around newsworthiness, topicality, powerful visuals, politics? What is it that they could try and do to really get your attention?
Sure. I've got a top 5 if you want to hear them.
Absolutely.
And so, number 1, we've mentioned specificity. Go through your go-to-market steps, and with any go-to-market strategy, that begins with who. Who's your audience? Who's the person you're targeting? That determines which outlets you want to appear in, right? And it should remind you also that you're not, as Simon mentioned this, you're not pitching to a VC. I don't care about how much cash you raised in your last round. So that's specificity. Number 2 is know your media, as I mentioned. Get your head around which outlets are most relevant to your startup and what interests them. And we'll get into the newsworthiness later. But you can. Gosh. Everyone has their own particular hobby horse, right? So find out what those are. Number 3 would be platform. Email is the least effective way to reach out to probably anyone, and certainly for journalists. I get hundreds of these things a day. They're the easiest thing to ignore. I ignore thousands every week, so I might star 5 stories. So have you tried LinkedIn or Twitter, or whatever they're calling it now? I'll probably accept a message from you on LinkedIn. I will probably ignore your email. Number 4 is data points, especially with sustainability innovations, and especially with air, especially with breathable cities. In any pitch, give me numbers I can hang a story on. What's the problem in numbers? What are the solutions in numbers? How do you compare those numbers? Make those numbers comparable. A lot of editors like to see a kind of qualitative body, fleshy qualitative body with a quantitative skeleton to like holding it together, holding it up, because that's measurable to them. So you've got all the human interest stuff, but you also need comparable figures that makes sense to an audience. And lastly, is it news? We're going back to, and you've got the luxury of the furore around LTNs and ULEs and all this stuff. So whenever this stuff pops up, bang, 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 fire that stuff out, because you're trying to be part of the solution. And that's especially important to outlets with a very broad audience, because these are, they're trying to turn these issues into lowest common denominator stuff. So it's, show your work and show you're part of the solution. So those are my 5.
Nice. Thanks, David. Simon?
Yeah, look, I think Dave's covered most of it there, to be honest. But I think again, it's sort of trying to kind of take a step back and think about what is your kind of strongest pitch to whichever media is you're trying to engage. So it could be the founder. If you've got a really strong female founder in a world of swimming in men, that is a huge asset that you can kind of go to pitches with. We talked about the visual stuff. That's a big thing. But as David said, the awareness of the kind of news agenda, really. So often there'll be kind of moments for startups in the run up to, say, CES every year. Loads of tech outlets, BBC included, will be looking for kind of really interesting startups in the kind of weeks and months before CES, Mobile World Congress. I mentioned Jitech. So there are these moments throughout the calendar, or particularly with more kind of environmentally focused startups. COP coming up later this year. In the run up to that, there'll just be this kind of increased appetite for kind of interesting stuff. And the good news is that one of the biggest trends in the media industry over the last, let's say, 10 years is a huge kind of focus on what is called solutions journalism, which is basically rather than, there's a feeling, and that particularly applies in climate journalism, that it's all constant doom and gloom, and there's no hope, and actually not just media, but the media especially has just kind of realized this is a huge turn off. I think probably governments are also realizing that as well. And so there's a massive emphasis on positive solutions, interesting solutions, and things that provide hope for people, which I guess everyone on this call pretty much is involved with one way or the other. So that again is one of your biggest assets that you have. If you can kind of elucidate what the problem is that you're attacking, what tangible benefit you could potentially make if successful, plus the things that are that stand in your way that you need to overcome, then again that starts to be the shape of what is a quite interesting pitch, really, in the climate space, I would say.
Brilliant. Okay, one final question. Thanks, Joe. We're coming to all of the Q&As in a minute. Give me 2 things to share with our audience today on what you should never do. All right, your experiences of 2 things that either PRs or startup teams do wrong, which doesn't help them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No bullshit claims, please. Don't say it's a game-changing solution and not, and then not explain how you get there. So that kind of goes back into my specificity bit. I want a little bit, it doesn't have to be granular detail, but I want something up front about what this is, not sort of airy-fairy, vague language. And yeah, I mean, in fact, we'll probably get into this later, but in Q&A, but you can pick up a lot from people on social media, from journalists on social media, with how they discuss this stuff, and with also Simon mentioned solutions people. So, for example, Dr. Jonathan Foley, if you follow him on social, you get an idea of how people are talking about solutions and how the media is responding to him. You can follow Covering Climate Now, which is a great organization for how media is evolving and adapting to transition and pollution and environmental and climate sort of stories. But you wanted one other negative thing.
Well, I think you mentioned, obviously, there's a diversity of ways to reach you, and maybe email isn't the best one.
So don't bother emailing. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn, bribe some of my phone number, whatever it might be, and get through via a different avenue.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Simon?
I think the one piece of advice I would say is that I would choose as you come to choose your PR agency, I would choose them carefully, because as we're hearing here, there's a reason why so many of these emails are kind of landing in poor old David's inbox every day. And that is because many PRs are incentivized in terms of their kind of business arrangements to send out emails, and they get credit for this. But as we're hearing, it's almost completely pointless.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So if you're kind of choosing a PR which has that as a kind of MO, you are wasting your money. And I would say try and find someone, especially in your kind of early stages, try and find a smaller PR agency perhaps who can kind of give you quite a bespoke solution, who kind of perhaps they're kind of on the up themselves, they're growing themselves, and maybe so they're going to give you a little bit of extra sort of TLC and actually kind of properly going to engage with your story rather than pay lip service. And I think there is sometimes a danger really that startups, I think sometimes I feel choose someone like Gaby, absolutely, Paul. Yeah. So someone, I think sometimes startups do make errors in some of those decisions at that crucial stage really in their development, which is probably quite costly, I suspect.
Yeah, definitely. Right, I am not going to waste any more time because I think we've gone over a little bit. Thank you so much for those invaluable tips. So we're now going to open this up to Q&As. I don't have a clue now who went first.
Joe had a question, and then I've got about 34 questions. So everyone else, please share your own. Otherwise, I'll ask them.
Okay. Shall we go with Joe?
No.
No? Yes, Joe.
Always happy to go first. Thanks very much. Typical Yank. Sorry, guys. What I would say is we're all in the same space. We're all fighting the same fight. And the media's perception of, call it Just Stop Oil, ULEZ, all of these things, it feels like their interpretation is always driven by general reactions, general response. So you end up getting this self-fulfilling positive feedback loop of the media and perception. Just Stop Oil has been, I don't love what they do. It raises a lot of awareness, but it's important that we have somebody drawing attention. And I always use the analogy of, and I've put a couple of posts on this, if you look at my LinkedIn, about we glorify people who are willing to die for their country, but we vilify those willing to die for the world. It's amazing what's happening, and that's all coming through the media's perception of the issue. So how do we approach the media and try to get them to tell that story in the light of, we're fighting everyone's battle here. Why is the media not on our side? And that's, I know they're not necessarily not on our side, but that's what comes across when you look at the ULEZ stories and you look at the stories, particularly with regard to Just Stop Oil.
I mean, I think it's David's fault. So David, you can answer that one.
It is my fault because I work on systems, and no, I mean, this is a systems issue, and the media. This is going to come across as the conspiracy theory, but this is just how economics works. The media, for example, in the UK. So most of you guys are either in or at least familiar with the UK. most large media outlets are owned by a vanishingly small number of overseas, let's say, non-domicile taxpayers, billionaires, and the work that Just Stop Oil and climate activists in general are doing, they feel is directly conflicts with their interest. So this is I write about this quite a lot. The fact that between 75 and 80% of the media are owned by people who feel that their lavish standard of living will be threatened by this call for what is essentially systems change. We need systems change. I don't think anyone here would disagree with that. Now, okay, so that's all well and good. What the hell do we do under those circumstances? Well, I mean, the least you can do is reach out to the kind of 20% who aren't beholden to those interests. But I think we as the media, we have a responsibility to explain the context, explain, the politicians and newspapers are not, they don't reflect public opinion. In the UK, net zero is wildly popular. Climate transition is a wildly popular policy proposal. Anything to do with renewable energy polls incredibly well, and many other climate initiatives. But what's happening is that it's the other way around. It's the media is very good at manipulating public opinion. So that's the situation we have.
Well, I'd say, to be honest, that I think you are probably, and we're probably getting away from the kind of core subject here, but I think that does start to get a bit conspiracy theory in the sense that there's obviously some truth to what you say, but the reality is that we are in this, sadly, the media doesn't have its responsibility, its job isn't, maybe it should be, but its job isn't to lead. That should be our kind of positive. Right. I actually think the media probably is reflecting a lot of mixed feelings actually across the population, which I think we'll see playing out in the next kind of UK and indeed US elections. So, it's true that in one sense, the top line is that everyone is wildly in favor of net zero until you ask them, oh yeah, do you want to pay any money for that? And then they're all like, no, we don't want to pay any money for that. So it is kind of quite confusing. And as we saw in that by-election recently, it's, there's a lot, it is quite a complicated situation. But what I would say, coming back to your point though, Joe, the media is not this homogenous thing. And, there are the part of the media you're describing, which is the sort of, perhaps the more sort of tabloid side of it, is one part, and it's obviously a very important part. It drives opinion and what have you. But the sort of part, there are lots of stratas and other parts of the media to get your message out, and I think they're the bits that I would be concentrating on in your shoes. Not to suggest that the point you're making is not important, but I think for a startup point of view, I think that's where you want to be looking elsewhere, basically. Great,
thank you. I mean, I sense it's an answer that you could be discussing that for hours.
Yeah, I think it probably does take us a little bit away from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a systems problem and massively complex and nuanced.
Yeah, but thanks for raising it, Joe. I think it's a big one, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Gaby, I have some quick fire questions whilst we're waiting for some others, if I may. For both of you, if you've covered a story before, for people like Gaby, our startups, it sort of feels that you're interested or invested in that story, that topic, that theme. Does that mean you want to hear more pitches in and around that topic or theme, or have you done it and want to move on? David.
Oh, right. Okay. No, I'm happy to return to themes if it moves the kind of narrative onward. So it could be a sequel to something or other. And I like we mentioned trade-offs, and maybe you're as a founder, you're coming along and you're dealing with the trade-offs in a completely different way. So in the way that I report stuff, I might come to that. I might return to that sphere, that sector, and say, well, and again, I have the luxury of being able to do this, but I can weave a narrative of these newcomers have a completely different way of going about it. So I certainly am happy to come back to things if I think that in the larger context it's making an impact.
Okay.
I think in the more mainstream world, look, there's no one size fits all, but I think generally speaking, while I think people are interested in kind of progression and what have you, I think the reality is that once a subject has been done, I mean, not that you would do air pollution once, say, and that's it, but I think what they wouldn't be interested in probably is following in minute detail the progress of a particular cohort of startups, say, or what have you. So, and if you did a big splash or what have you about air pollution, well, yeah, the chances are it would be a little while before you kind of return to the subject.
Yeah. That's fair.
Just before your next quick fire, Paul, Masood has a question. Go ahead, Masood.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, you both mentioned trying to create a positive spin, but what if the news or the major issue that you're bringing is actually kind of bad news, so the numbers are all bad and everyone's got the numbers completely wrong, as an example?
I think you're being very specific about climate maps.
True, I guess. So if I take it a step back, is it okay to lead with something that's negative and doesn't necessarily have a feel-good factor to it? Yeah,
I would say so, for sure. I mean, if what you're doing is bringing illumination to something which people, were kind of partially in the dark about, then I think that's a kind of really interesting and important story. No, and in a sense, I suppose when I say solutions, in a sense, what you are providing there is a solution in a way. You're providing a solution in the form of, greater information to a particular area. So I would still say there's a positive there, in the same way that I suspect this will be the same for David, having heard him talk about his interests. But one area of interest for me has been, in order to solve many of problems in climate generally, it's like having more accurate measurements of the problem is the only way to do that. So you can see if you're affecting an impactful change and a meaningful change with your solutions. So yeah, I think, look, it's a kind of derivative, if you like, but it's still a positive, I think. What you're doing.
Yeah, Masood, there's nothing negative about that story. You have a climate solution there. You're helping. You're trying to help. So don't frame it that way. I mean, you're highlighting the work you're doing is showing something that is deleterious to us all, but you're trying to help, and hopefully in the broader scheme of things, you can show why your solution is more granular, more effective, more scalable, and all that stuff than all these pretenders out there.
So if you want to talk, I mean, look, I don't know the specifics of your example, Masood, but the headline in my head would be, Masood's solution provides 10 times better information, which paves the way to greater air pollution solutions, or whatever it might be, rather than, Masood has discovered that the problem's loads worse than we thought previously. So it is absolutely a positive. It's just how you kind of characterize it.
Yeah. I mean, just to quickly add, and you're using satellite data, using GIS, you got this going more high resolution than ever before. This is extremely. There's a lot of really exciting, positive developments in that space that people want to hear about, and it's like, oh yeah, maybe we do have a snowball's chance in hell of surviving this.
And by the way, to take that further, Masood, it's like, so if you imagine, so again, I'm thinking about the visuals here. It's like, let's say we see your kind of visualization of the data versus, one of the pre-existing one or whatever, and suddenly it's like we can see side by side the difference that your solution is able to, the greater clarity that your solution brings. So there's a really nice visual example there as well. So you can easily build that up into a really nice story.
Thank you very much.
Good to hear. Paul, should we go back to you for your next one?
I have lots more, but please add in your own questions.
Yeah.
David, early on, you said that because the business model behind journalism, there's a clickbaity type journals, there's more traditional editorial led. Obviously, the startups here want to try and get a story out there, get some PR, get lots of links, leads, sell loads, buy their yachts. They're looking for PR in order to get their to build their business. And in terms of trade-off or in terms of impact to the startup and their founders, which one has more value? Is it a clickbaity one, which I imagine might do quite well but disappear fairly quickly, or a more traditional media where it's likely to stick around a bit more?
I mean, there's a million ways to, skin a cat. Horrible expression, but I mean, the same story could appeal in a different way to both of those things you described.
Okay.
It depends how you present it. And if it seems to me that this story is pure clickbait, I'm probably not going to run it anyway. Someone else might, if I think it's going to get. So there are to explain a couple of things. There are platforms out there that will not start paying their journalists until they've got X number of clicks, and I mean X number of 100,000 clicks. So that's why you see so much clickbait. It's because the only mechanism to reward that work is making it in your face, lowest common denominator, silly. So that can in fact hide a very serious and useful and important and interesting story. So you can do it in both ways. But I think if you're just going the route of pure clickbait, then it's not. I don't think it's not something that I would go for, and it's not something that a serious editor would be interested in. So try to lead with, we can come up with the clickbait. You guys have to come up with the actual work.
Kristen.
Sorry, did you say Kristen? Yeah. Oh, hello. How do you, can I say this? How should you go about getting PR, and should you get PR if your innovation is not yet public and won't be public for the next year because of IP reasons?
I mean,
Simon spoke authoritatively already. Yeah, go ahead.
I personally wouldn't. Look, Paul, you're probably better to advise about such things, but in my view, I would say I would have thought that's wasting your money at that stage if you're that early.
I would agree with that. The most effective stuff from very early stage startups for me has been individuals and founders reaching out to me personally. That's where that's good value, and probably if they got a PR to do the same thing, I'm going to probably ignore it.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Sorry, Paul, I know you got another one. Is there, would you say it's harder for a startup in hardware to achieve story traction, than it is if they're in tech, high tech or software? Just because it seems to be an industry that doesn't have the same glitter as a software.
I would say, I mean, these things go in cycles a little bit. I mean, certainly, I'm trying to think exactly my timescales here, but certainly until about 4 or 5 years ago, CES, for example, we would go there every year, and it was all about the hardware, and that's whole hardware. That was all the cool stuff, and then of course suddenly it's AI, with VR, AR, then AI, and so. And so in some ways, but in some ways, it's always quite nice to be the counter example, I suppose. If you've got a cool bit of hardware these days, that's really interesting because it's tangible. You can see it. It's great visuals. You can, there's something to film from my perspective. So I would say no, but it depends on, as ever, it depends on the story that's behind it, really, and what it is. But I definitely don't think it's a disadvantage.
No, yeah, I mean, not to take anything away from the software as a service guys, but it's nice to have something you can hold or break or look at, or because it's something tangible. And again, yeah, the software as a service is very difficult to do good visuals for. It's fiendishly difficult. And whereas you got a product.
Yeah, it's also quite hard as a journalist as well. Look, we're having to tackle stories at light speed really often, and the one thing that you're always nervous about as a journalist is that you're reporting something which is basically BS essentially.
That's right.
And the thing is, there's something quite reassuring when you've got something physical in front of you that you can actually prod and see. And so it's quite hard to kind of interrogate some of the software solutions sometimes and actually prove they do what they say they do. So
yeah. They're much more abstract, and journalists, we're just apes really. We just want to knock on stuff and
Fair enough, thank you. Oh gosh, we've got 2 minutes left of this. Paul, did you have another question you wanted to pose?
Always got questions. Thinking about air pollution, Simon, David, what would make you go, fuck me, got to cover this air pollution story next week? What would be the dream one-liner to get into your inbox, your DMs, your LinkedIn?
Oof. Wow. Gosh. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it would be something that had a lot of buy-in from all sorts of stakeholders. So maybe you'd gone to a bunch of cities and they were really interested, and you had done enough MRV to say this can be done, and that you've got some really impressive stats that you've somehow sucking the particulates out of the air in a way that's not been done before, and the economics make sense. It's going to have to, and it's going to be it's a bit unicorn to say this, but so if to break through in that way, you would have to hit a lot of buttons and tick a lot of boxes, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, MRV.
Oh yes, measurement, reporting, and verification. So that's kind of that's when you're demonstrating to yourself and to everyone else that this thing, it works and it's not having negative effects. So and perhaps it can have co-benefits. So MRV is the process for any let's say large scale innovation that has an environmental effect. So once you've done good MRV, and you'll hear this a lot out there when people talk about, for example, direct air capture. What's the blowback? What are the negatives? And I think actually, if I want to think about one key metric, I would say, is your solution energy efficient? In fact, right now, that's what I'm thinking about. Are any of these air pollution innovations energy efficient? Because I think that's where the shit hits the fan.
Amazing. So I suspect you might get a few messages from startups who are sucking out particulate matter in energy efficient ways over the next couple of days. And Simon,
very quickly, because I can see we're at the end, aren't we? But yeah, for me, it's kind of it's a simple and scalable, I think, is the kind of the two things that I can look for. So and I'd say that's what I like about some of the breathable cities solutions, which is just you can see that if some of they feel scalable and deliverable because they are relatively simple, which I think is there's an elegance there, which I think gives you hope that they can make a big difference.
Amazing.
Amazing.
That's a good observation.
We're getting lots of applause as people are having to obviously leave. We've gone over a little bit, but not very much. I think it's just time to say massive thank you to David and Simon. Also, best way to reach you guys, I think, David, your LinkedIn, right?
Yep.
Where to see your work. Simon?
Yeah, LinkedIn's good for me as well. yeah, or by all means share my email address. That's fine as well.
Awesome. And for whoever is left on the call, thank you so much for joining us today. There will be a link. We'll share that with everybody. And I just want to say thank you again. Hopefully see you soon.
Lovely. Good luck, guys. See you soon.
Cheers.
Bye all.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Super interesting.
Oh, yeah. Hold on a minute. Simon's gone. Yay. The Fab Four.
Well done. Hang on 2 secs. Just removing. Nice, that went really well.
Yeah. Oh, Camilla, you're on mute.